Chapter 13, Killing Mr. Griffin, page 148. The story was on the 6 o'clock news, and Mr. McConnell brought it up at dinner. On television this evening, they were telling about a Del Norte teacher who's been reported missing. Missing? Mrs. McConnell repeated. Missing? How? Do you mean he's simply disappeared? That's about the size of it. He taught his classes yesterday and then was never seen again. His name's Brian Griffin. Sue, don't you have a class with him? Yes, Sue said faintly. English, first period. They gave his description. 41 years old, medium height and weight, dark hair, mustache. The car he drives is missing also, a dark green Chevy. I wish my teachers would disappear, Greg said enviously. Sue gets all the luck. Don't joke about something like this, Craig, his mother said. Think how you would feel if it were Dad. Personally, I can't imagine anything more horrible than to have something like this occur to someone in your family. The waiting, the uncertainty, all the terrible possibilities that would float through your mind would be enough to drive the soundest person totally insane. He's married, too, Mr. McConnell said. They said his wife is offering a $1,000 reward for any information leading to his location. That's a lot of money, Frances said. Boy, I sure wish I knew where he was. Think, Mel, $1,000. We'd be rich. What would you do with it? Melvin asked. I'd buy models and a new 10-speed. I'd buy Bruce Rogoff's drum set, Craig said. You know, those neat drums his folks bought him for his birthday? Well, he's tired of them. He wants a sax instead. Imagine, Mrs. McConnell exclaimed, those expensive drums. And they were off on another subject with Brian Griffin forgotten. I'm not going to think about him, Susan told herself desperately. I will make my mind go on to other things. So she tried her best to contribute to the dinner table conversation and found herself noticing small things that she had never appreciated before. The kindness behind her father's teasing, the warmth in her mother's smile, the endearing earnestness with which the twins cut their meat, sawing each slice into careful squares and then shoveling 3 or 4 of them into their mouths at once, the bones and angles of Craig's face, emerging suddenly from the soft roundness of childhood. I love them so much, Susan thought. How could I ever have imagined that I didn't? And with the thought came a sense of loss, as though she had moved 1,000,000 miles beyond this family and were seeing them in memory, reaching back toward them, yet unable to touch them. I am not Susan any longer, she thought. I am not the person they know as their daughter and their sister. I am a stranger who has lived through things they could not even imagine and who has changed into someone foreign to them all. They look at me and call me Sue, and I speak back to them, and they never guess how far away from them I am and how much I miss them. When dinner was over, Susan cleared the table and helped Craig load the dishwasher. The twins, whose job it was to wash the pans, stood at the sink and fought over who could do the broiler. And Mr. McConnell went into the den and turned on the television. Mrs. McConnell plugged in the electric coffee maker and got out 2 cups. Would you like some tonight, Sue? No, thank you, Susan said. The doorbell rang. You might as well get it, honey, Mother said. It will probably be David. She can't go out till she's done her part of the kitchen, Craig objected. She got out of it last night because she was sick, but it's not fair 2 nights in a row. I'm not going anywhere, Susan told him. I don't feel like going out. Then what's he coming over for? But it was not David who stood at the door when Susan opened it, but a middle-aged woman in a brown car coat. I'm looking for Susan McConnell, she said. Is this the right house? Yes, Susan said, bewildered. I'm Mrs. Griffin. For a moment, Susan could not bring herself to move. She stood frozen, staring into the unfamiliar face. Who is it, Sue? Her mother called from the kitchen. When Susan did not answer, Mrs. McConnell came into the hallway. Hello, can I help you? I'm Mrs. Griffin, the woman said. Kathy Griffin? I'd like to talk to Susan. Mrs. Griffin, the wife of Sue's teacher? Mrs. McConnell came quickly over to her. Where are your manners, Sue? Can't you invite your guest inside? Please come in, Mrs. Griffin. We just heard the distressing news about your husband and are so concerned. Is there anything new since the report on the evening news? No, nothing, the woman said. She stepped through the door into the hallway, and Susan saw that her first impression had been incorrect, and Kathy Griffin was no older than her late 20s. It was the strained look of her face that had made her appear older. "Come, sit down," Susan's mother said. "Let me take your coat. Can I get you some coffee?" "My husband and I were just going to have some." "No, thank you." Under the coat, the woman was wearing navy blue slacks and a pink maternity blouse with a white collar. She looked very tired. "I just wanted to talk with your daughter a few minutes. According to the police, she was the last person to see my husband yesterday, and she told them some things that I just can't accept." "Sue was the last to see him?" Mrs. McConnell turned to Susan in surprise. "You didn't tell us that." "Didn't I?" Susan said. "I thought I did." "Well, of course you didn't." Her mother gestured the other woman toward a chair. "Please, sit down. I'm sure Sue wants to help in any way she can. Let me get my husband. He'll want to help too, if possible." "We all do." She raised her voice. "Ed, come out here, dear. Mr. Griffin's wife is here to talk with Sue." Mr. McConnell came in from the den, and introductions were made, and the twins and Craig came in, bright-faced and curious, and were also introduced, and were then sent back to the kitchen. I cannot go through with this, Susan thought, and yet somehow she found herself seated on the sofa between her parents with Mrs. Griffin directly across from her, and she was saying, "Yes, I had a conference with him after school. I did see him then." "What did you talk about?" Kathy Griffin asked her. "Your song for Ophelia?" The question was so far from what she had expected that Susan stopped, disconcerted. "Why, yes, he did mention that. How did you know?" "He told me about it at breakfast. He said your song was an exceptionally good one, that you were a sensitive young writer." "He did? What song?" Mrs. McConnell asked. "I'm afraid you've left us behind here. Did you write a song, Sue?" "Not with music," Susan said. "It was more of a poem. It was to be the last song Ophelia sang before her death. We all had to do it. It was an assignment." "Brian isn't an easy teacher," Kathy Griffin said. "He's demanding of his students. Too demanding, I sometimes think. He feels he has such a short time with them. He wants to bring them just as far as he can before they're out of his hands. He's a dedicated teacher, and he gets very excited about his better students. He considers Susan one of his good ones." "That's a fine compliment," Mr. McConnell said. "I'm sure it must mean a lot to Sue to hear that." "It's because of that, because she has been special to him. I couldn't believe..." She turned her gaze from the senior McConnells to Susan herself, directing the question to her. "Why did you lie to the police about what Brian did when he left school?" There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Susan said, I don't know what you mean." "Of course you know. You made up several things about the interview. You told the police that Brian was jumpy, that he kept glancing at his watch, and hardly paid any attention to what he was talking about. I know that's not true. Brian took his conferences with students very seriously. He made notes ahead of time of the things he wanted to discuss with them. He cared. He cared deeply about such things. He would not have acted the way you said he did." "He did," Susan said. "He kept looking at his watch. What would you say if I told you Brian wasn't wearing a watch?"